rural innovation, rural development processes, and also she has an interest on remote and depopulating rural areas, governance and rural gender relations. So Bettina is here today to talk about reappraisal of nexogenous development. Thanks very much for coming. And we also have two ESRs, Colm Stockdale and Federica Marturo, that will kick off the discussion after Bettina's talk. Bettina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vasily. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Also because it gives me the occasion to reflect and reconsider what I have done and thought and written about rural development. I've done research on rural development for, I think, almost 30 years now, mostly in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, among others by way of PhD students in Uzbekistan, in Korea, in Japan, in Africa, so in many parts of the world. But most of my work is in Europe. And whereas I was always a huge fan of endogenous rural development, in the years I developed some doubt. Also by experiencing by doing a lot of research in the north of the Netherlands, which are our peripheral regions. And what you see is that particularly the most marginal rural areas have profited little from endogenous rural development research. And I thought about that, and my ideas around exogenous development, I think it's already 7 years ago that I talked about that, were a first step in that direction. And now I will tell you a little bit about that, and also where I stand now. Let's see, what's this page down here? So what I want to talk about today is what are rural development issues today in Europe, how can we understand them theoretically, how does policy respond, and what is the role of civic initiatives and collaborative workspaces. To be honest, I don't say a lot about that in my talk, but after the excellent explanation yesterday by Vasily, I think I know a couple of them. I always had a different idea about it, but when he was talking about creative hubs, I think I know a couple of them. And then coming to the end, what does it mean for nexogenous development? So if we look into rural development into the past, one of the things that since modernization and industrialization, the idea of the rural exodus was shared, or was seen as almost natural. And I could imagine also here. So when industries closed, people moved away, or when agriculture became mechanized, a lot of people moved into industries in the city. What we have seen in the last decade is an accelerated rate of urbanization, and even what we also call metropolization. So it's not only the growth of cities, but it's the massive expansion of cities, incorporating lots of rural areas. And what we have seen, I think that's somewhere in the 90s, was that now more than 50% of people actually live in urban compared to rural areas, which differs, by the way, a lot across the world. What we have also seen in the last 100 years, a process of differentiation. So as I said, with the course of urbanization, a lot of rural areas have been eaten up by cities, disappeared, have been incorporated. Some rural areas, in particular around cities, have become urbanized by counter-urbanization, so urban people moving into the rural areas close to the city, and the expansion of rural lifestyles. In a lot of these cases, they became also gentrified. And we have seen other parts of the rural areas becoming very marginal and peripheralized. And this, I would say, has become even more pronounced in the last 5 to 10 years. Some even talk about urban colonization. This is a picture from during COVID from Wales. I think you come from Wales.
I'm from Snowdonia.
You know, I think it's a beautiful poster. But actually, what they try to get to keep people out of Wales, because what we have seen is that people from the cities moved into the rural areas, which were experienced as more safe, offering more room. And in that course, they also brought the virus into the rural areas. So at some point during the pandemic, the virus was everywhere, but a couple of rural areas have experienced this coming in of urban, colonizing by urban residents, trying to, as a rural refuge, it has also been discussed. In Greece, by the way, also during the crisis, the rural as a refuge. We see, in particular in the Netherlands at this moment, where we have a serious lack of housing, that people buy houses in nearby rural areas, moving into the rural areas, pushing prices up because they can spend a lot of money. And in that sense, also newcomers coming in, changing the rural areas, gentrifying the rural areas, with houses becoming unaffordable for people living originally in these rural areas. And I think we can also, tourism and digital nomads, consider as colonizers in certain parts of the world, beautiful parts of the world where they can live cheap and can work, do their well-paid work from very cheap places, beautiful places in the world. And in France, we just had a discussion about France. There are several places where I used to go to the Lot, and in the Lot is down the Dordogne, we find many English refugees buying houses, starting bed and breakfast, where French people move away because they cannot find a job. So we get a weird kind of dimensions also in this urban-rural relation. At the same time, we see the emergence of what is also called inner peripheries, particularly popular in Italy, where we see that there are inner areas, and in Italy it's literally the inner areas become depopulated with mainly aging people remaining. And in some of these areas, and I think that is also the case in Italy, where we see migrants and refugees moving into these inner peripheries. So they are inner because they are in Italy, it's literally the core of the country. We see the same in Spain. In the Netherlands, it's at the margins of the country, at the border. So it's more the border peripheries than the inner peripheries. But it's also very wisely used in Italy, is the inner areas are the core of the country. So the core of the country is becoming empty, is becoming marginal. And what does that mean for a country if there is a core that is losing wealth? They are inner peripheries, so as I said, also politically, maybe culturally, in the sense of how they are looked upon, with very little investment in housing and services, the disappearance of employment, and also the rise of a feeling of abandonment. We have seen that, it has been described for the United States, but we see that happening also in Europe. And I will come back also to the Netherlands, where that is also quite extreme. And many of those areas, of the rural areas, it's not necessary, I say socio-demographically and socio-politically are really the same areas. When it comes to ecological peripheralization, that are partly the same, but not necessarily. But in many rural areas, we see that climate change, drought, or too much rain is undermining their primary economic activities and the quality of life. And that is certainly true for the core of Spain, where we had temperature above 45 degrees in summer. I wasn't there, but but I was in France, and in France it was quite hot as well. In areas. I don't know if you have know about the long-term vision of the rural areas. It's a recent initiative of the European Union, which tries to develop a new vision for rural areas, but also tries to push the European governments to invest in rural areas. And in this long-term vision of rural areas, you see all these problems that I was identifying reappearing. Loss of services, loss of employment, the need for newcomers, for people coming in, also in farming, problems around poverty, problems around climate change. And a call for innovation, digital and social innovation. And to social innovation, I will come back. It's an ambitious policy in difficult times. And I will say a little bit about the Netherlands. I don't know if you have seen it in the newspapers, but we had lots of violent protests, in particular by farmers who were opposing a new policy which tries to fight the too high nitrogen emissions and calls for, in some areas, up to 90% less animals. And it's really necessary, I think, to change Dutch agriculture, but the way it was communicated was experienced as really, a blow in the face of farmers. And it combines with the feeling of abandonment among rural residents. So what we see now in some rural areas, we have seen that in the United States when the national flag was turned upside down. I don't know if you have that symbol also in other countries. They did it also in the Netherlands. And I think it's in the Navy, it's like a cry for help, but it's also an indication of the loss of faith. So we see this turning around because normally the red has to be upside. Along streets in rural areas. So it's not just farmers, it's also a lot of rural residents and also all kind of people who feel let down by the government, also around COVID, getting on the same wagon. And this particular party, which calls itself the Farmer Resident Movement, presents itself as the rural party. And it's really, at the moment, it's about 16% of the seats and about 10, in some areas up to 20, 30% of votes. And we have regional elections coming up in March. So there is fright about this. And they are pro-industrialization, quite conservative. It's a weird mixture of political standpoints, but they're one of those at least populist parties. Rural extremists is maybe too much, but populist there for sure. And what they point, and so we can argue about their political program, but what they do very cleverly is using this feeling of abandonment, identifying the danger of a loss of social cohesion, and also the stressed relations between the government and the residents. So they're very cleverly using that. And we have seen that, of course, also in other parts of the world. So what I would like to argue, and I will come to the importance of relations also later on, is that we see what is at stake at the moment in rural development is tension in relations between urban and rural areas, but maybe even more between government and citizen, between urban and rural lifestyles, and between nature and agriculture. It's also used like that politically. That is very clearly the case in the Netherlands, but in many other parts of Europe for sure, and maybe also other parts of the world, with increasing concern about exclusion at the social and territorial level, and return of what I would say core periphery dynamics in Europe, and frightening political effects. And not all of the effects have to do with the rule, but a lot has to do with the loss of faith and the loss of trust in the government. And I'm not an expert in Italy, but I would argue that in Italy, loss of faith and loss of trust has also to do with the recent outcome, the outcome of the recent elections. And I think that is frightening, and really, personally, I'm frightened by what is happening in politics right now. But how can we understand these issues theoretically, coming back to more safer grounds? A lot of these problems have existed for a very, very, very long time. They are not new, but maybe they became more significant. And what we see certainly now is that a lot of the problems are not originating in rural areas. They are very much related to crisis elsewhere, to developments elsewhere. The financial crisis, the political crisis, the ecological crisis. All that interacts very clearly with what is happening in rural areas. And of course, the effect of the Ukraine war on food prices, you can see it immediately. But a lot of, for the other issues, that is true as well. We also see that what is happening there and how it should be addressed is not just in interest of rural areas. No, we need to deal, for instance, with climate change, not just for the rural areas, it's in global interest. And what is happening in rural areas, what is happening in agriculture, will be crucial for fighting climate change. So I think all these are indications of what is happening around rural development cannot be understood on its own. It has to be considered as an interlinked, related issue. As I said in the beginning, I was a firm believer in endogenous development, and it's not that I lost faith, but I started doubting. And this idea of rural development is born from within, by way of community engagement, locally specific and participatory, has been cherished by many. But at the same time, we see this idea, which has been already quite some time ago, and Rokopis brought up that development actually is aspatial, becomes very prominent as well. Aspatial in the sense that it's not born in a particular place, but resulting from the interaction of networks, of places. And if rural development is aspatial, then the unit of our analysis cannot just be a geographic place, a specific place. We have to consider the place in its network and in the dynamic of the network. And if development is aspatial, then resources cannot be just endogenous or just exogenous. It's actually also then the network position defines the access to resources. And a lot of places are not, and a lot of people are not so linked to one particular place anymore. Look at us. We're moving around, meet in various places. You do your research in other places that you came from, and in multiple places. And a lot of these places are linked. And actually, of course, we know that, and it has been theorized already a long time ago by Castell in his idea of the network society. Our places, we are all nodes in a network, live in different places, or are connected with people who live in other places immediately. We can be in multiple places at the same time. And of course, that's not true for everybody. There are people who are constrained to one particular place. But the world has become a network, and the network and the dynamic of the network is defining what places can do and cannot do. We know that these networks are dynamic. We also know that the networks differ in how dense they are, or how expanded they are, or how close to each other relations are. And this is like a moving picture. And it depends on where you are in this network, if you are at the core or at the margin, to how many other places you are related, and how your place emerges from that network position. So it is not just collaborated, because that was already in the neo-endogenous approach, but it's emerging from how the network itself moves. It's also flexible, continuously moving. And I would say, looking back at the many civic initiatives, I know many of the place-based initiatives are not just born in places, but are related to people who bring in ideas, who know people somewhere else, who bring in connections, who bring in money, who bring in support. So a lot of successful village initiatives are well connected, are not just in that specific local place. But what we also see is that so some villages are very, very capable to organize all kinds of initiatives, to organize, to cope with the loss of services, to maintain services, but there are also villages that do not do anything to confront developments, which do not come into action. And very often you can see that they differ in composition of the population, but by way for instance, of the composition of the population also differ in networks. Very often they are also at specific places, more isolated, either geographically or socially or politically. So networks matter a lot. The development is also relational in the sense of comparison, because you are highly developed or underdeveloped relative compared to other places. And what you see is places that are disconnected. This is a picture. This summer I was in Croatia, and there was this beautiful place, and I shared at the very first slide there was a picture called Groznan. Groznan was is a place which started to lose population after the railway connection that linked several rural places to harbor places and made them very successful trading places. And at some point in 1923, the railway was closed and all these villages depopulated. And a lot of them became, this is one of those places. But Groznan was considered as a place worthy to invest in, and they started a music school. They invited artists they could have the houses almost for free if they would develop them and stay there. And now it's a vibrant place, not only for tourists, but also for all kind of music workshops, for drummers, for opera, for theater. So it's really beautiful, but only 10 kilometers further on, you see this village. It was as connected to the railway, was as disconnected as the other one, but not invested in. And the one, Groznan, has about 800, 900 inhabitants. There are 40 there, living in houses next to a house like that. I was surprised also that here you can see very wealthy houses next to a house which is falling apart. I don't know how that is possible in this city. Here it's in between villages. So there are places that are considered worthy to invest in, and there are places which are not worthy to invest in. Many of those places are also places where people then disengage from, do not become active, might leave because their future is considered to be elsewhere. And what is a very interesting theory in this regard, and some of you might know it, is peripheralization theory by a German scientist called Kuhn. His theory is about the interlinkage between centralization and peripheralization. So if we consider development to emerge from development, you can see that some places profit and some places are, because investments are centralized there, and at the same time, and also at the course of that, other places lose development, peripheralize. And these places then become different in terms of their economic position, in terms of their social position, and in terms of their political position. And I underscore two processes, the dependency and stigmatization. So when the places, the central places invested in, which are generally the metropoles, are those that are rich, also in political power, they can decide whether or not other regions are invested in. So in order to receive investment, in order to receive finances, the peripheralized places are in the dependent position. And very often these places are also stigmatized, sometimes also stigmatized by the lack of civic initiatives. Why don't they become active like these other villages? Why don't they do anything? They should also develop themselves. Also, one aspect of this relative development. I always have to look for the question. So what he says is peripheralization should be viewed as a multidimensional process of demotion or downgrading of socio-spatial unit in relation to other socio-political units, one that can only be explained with reference to the interaction of economic, social, and political dimensions. Which also says that social exclusion as a consequence of that development is a social process, but also a spatial process, or also spatially expressed. So how does policy respond? A very quick, and many of you might know that, reconsideration of European politics, because in rural development, European politics, of course, are very important. What you see in the course of time is from directly after the war, when rural development equalizes actually investment in farming, a consideration of regions that lag behind an importance of investing in social cohesion, and also recognition of the importance that there shouldn't be too big differences between parts of Europe, and also in time a reorganization of governance, you could say. So from a very clearly top-down consideration of investing, modernizing agriculture, more and more a turn towards bottom-up development, endogenous development, or how it is now said, community development. Initially, with LEADER, that was an experiment, but in the course of time, this kind of policy became mainstream for all regions, rural, urban, and coastal. So overall, the idea is that community development is the way to go. And this idea of endogenous development that came up in the 1980s became dominant. And what you can see if you look into the quotes is that the vocabulary is slightly different, but the idea is still the same. It should be about local needs, about indigenous potential, about participation, local and community driven. Oh, that was not the, sorry. I went down to the end immediately. That was not the idea. How do I get back? Slideshow, but I don't see the
Last slide, you mean?
Yeah, the last I used, yeah. No. Up. There's not a. Go here. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. No. Maybe a slideshow, and then from this slide. From current slide here. Okay. I think I was here. Yeah. Here. Probably the first Cook Declaration, a lot of you might not remember. There was a second Cook Declaration not so long ago, and that is where it became, this idea of community-driven development became the dominant model, and it's still now today in the most recent CUP. And the idea is that by way of LEADER, or following the principle of LEADER, places, regions should develop themselves. But what can citizens do? I already said that in some places you see very, very active citizen developing all kinds of activities, assuring the quality of rural life by maintaining services, organizing transport, organizing healthcare, organizing schooling, all kinds of activities, and in these creative hubs can play a very important role. Last week I was in a school in a rural place. They managed to keep up the school by organizing all kind of creative courses for everybody in the region, together with business. So everybody who wanted to learn something, they said, come to us, tell me what you want to learn, and I will arrange it. And they really very creative. They're expected, these kind of initiatives are expected to be locally driven and locally based, and to be driven by residents. But do these kind of initiatives, this kind of social innovation, does it really need to be local? Does it need to be driven by local citizens? And I want to tell you about two examples which I find very exciting, because they seem to initiate a different kind of movement, which is more relational. And the first is an I think it's an association. I'm not totally sure what yes, because I'm a member. It's an association, and it's called Our Land. And what they do is you become a member, and then you can buy little pieces of land. Already for 20 euro, you buy like somebody told me it's like a francobolli. What's a stamp, a little piece of land. But together, you get loads of land. And the idea is by people, and many of their members actually from cities, you can decide what to do with the land. It's literally our land, and we don't want the government anymore to decide on it. We don't want farmers to be the sole owners of the land, because 65% of the land is owned by farmers. We want to own our land and decide then what to use it for. So they buy land and then try to find farmers who work in a nature-inclusive, often organic way, and start a different kind of agriculture. I find it a fascinating idea, revolutionary capitalist, but turning it around in the sense that you can indeed decide on what our land is used for. A similar association exists also in Germany, I know. And the idea is by becoming a co-owner of the land, so you're not the singular owner because you own it together with others, you can work directly on the regeneration of the landscape and biodiversity. And you can also block other movements. So they tried, they didn't manage in the end, but they raised a lot of concern and opposition against the start of a data center. So one of these huge things. And what they wanted is they wanted to try, the municipality had already decided to sell the land to Google to start this data center, and there was a lot of opposition, and they didn't manage, but they wanted to buy the land from the municipality to block that development. But so you can see that they really try to become a political actor. And it's about, it's not local, it's not about local land. It's people from everywhere in the Netherlands who buy land together with others to make together decide that the land, some land will be used in a different way that is more conform to the conservation of the soil, biodiversity, and climate change. This is what they tried to, that is the place where they tried to block the data center, and this is where they try to conserve a piece of land which is now used for urban gardening, and the city wants to build houses. And they also try to buy that land to oppose that development. Clearly a civic initiative, but not local, but concerning rural areas. The other example is more local. It's two farm women who started this activity also in the north of the Netherlands, where they try to find new ways to maintain their farm. So what they say is, they say, I produce food, okay, but I produce many more values. I also maintain landscape. I also organize activities for children, and all these values are not paid for. And what they are organizing is dialogues with other people in the region, also a local business, to say, okay, this is what I do. Which value does it have for you? And would you be interested to pay for some of these values?